Energy Matters podcast. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I am your host Kassem Alokla from TexasA&M University Society of Petroleum Engineers Student Chapter, TAMU-SPE. The aim of this podcast is to discuss and explore some specific topics about the energy industry in general and oil and gas in specific, while covering some related topics in environment, economics, policy, and many more. Howdy, and welcome to TAMU-SPE Energy Matters podcast, episode number 14, Innovating Energy, Insights on Heavy Oil and Chevron's Low Carbon Efforts. Today, we are joined by Chris Lolley, Chevron's Lower Carbon Director. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today.
Welcome. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. All right. Before starting our episode, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Chris Lolley is a seasoned engineer with over 25 years in the energy industry, mainly with TexasA and Chevron. He has expertise in reservoir development, reserves, production, and technology deployment across various asset classes and business units. He holds a BS and Master's in Chemical Engineering from TexasA&M University. At Chevron, he has held leadership roles in technology, asset development, and reservoir management. In 2024, he was named the Lower Carbon Director, focusing on reducing Chevron's carbon footprint. Again, thank you, Chris. And now let's start with our questions. And first of all, I'm going to focus mainly on your education and early passion. So how did your time at TexasA&M, particularly your research in heavy oil, fluid characterization, and thermodynamics, prepare you for your career in the energy industry?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Both of my degrees are chemical engineering, and yet I've always been considered a petroleum engineer with the company. Everyone's like, well, how did that happen? And it's because I was in a special program at A&M, and it was an accelerated master's program where you did your research out in industry, and you started like the summer of your junior year. Then your senior year, you're supposed to take graduate level electives. And then you credit by exam for the undergraduate. So it's like you kill two birds with one stone. And my research happened to be at Texaco's Exploration and Production Technology Department. And it was all about heavy oil fluid characterization, compositional reservoir simulation, equations of state. So that I was basically doing reservoir simulation, reservoir engineering.
That's cool. That's really cool. And could you please remind us who were your advisors? Did you have any petroleum engineering advisors during your master's?
I did. So Dr. Barafet was on my committee. Dr. Ching Wu, he's since retired from the department. He was on my committee.
Mm-hmm.
And then from the chemical engineering department, it was Dr. Eubank. And then we also had one of the researchers from Texaco, Dr. Richardson, was also on my committee. So yeah, it was very much a cross-functional. It was chemical engineering, petroleum engineering, and industry when I defended. So yeah, it was a great project. And full transparency, I was actually going to continue and get a PhD, but it was one of those things where after I finished my research, Texaco was like, "No, we want you to come work for us." And I was like, "Okay." And they sort of made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I was like, "Okay." So I ended up.
That's really cool. Do you regret not going for PhD?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I do. Just because, the one nice thing about graduate work is you really get to tackle a problem from a more in-depth perspective.
Right.
And, with a PhD, it's that much more even than a master's. And I think the other thing about a PhD is if you ever want to go back and, for example, be a professor or whatever, you really need the PhD. So yes, part of me does regret it sometimes, but I've had a wonderful career with Texaco and Chevron. So
for sure. All right. Everyone knows that you have a big love for TexasA&M. Everyone at Chevron, everyone at TexasA&M, there's no doubt about this. So as a proud Aggie, how has your experience at TexasA&M influenced your professional journey and your approach to leadership and innovation in the energy sector?
Sure. So, the one thing about Texas A&M is it's not just like it's a large research university and you get a great education, but it's also about the camaraderie. It's also about you know, they call it the other education, all the activities that you get involved in. I met lifelong friends there, but you really, you really understand the importance of teaming and partnering with others,
Mhm.
and that sort of carried into uh, from my academic career to Chevron, and I really understood the importance of teaming with others. So
Mhm.
I think that's one thing that I really got from A&M.
Mhm. That's really cool. All right. You also had some like workshops and courses that you have developed and taught at Chevron. Could you please share more insights into that and how like, these kind of workshops and courses like contributed to your professional growth as an engineer also in the energy industry?
Sure. So because of the nature of my research, you know, I started in the heavy oil and thermal research group.
Mhm.
And then I transferred out into a business unit in Bakersfield, California, worked almost all their assets there, and then went to Mid-Continent Business Unit. And then I ended up coming back to the Technology Center. And it was in that as one of the lead roles there that we developed a bunch of workshops for our heavy oil business units as well as our JV assets. And so I've taught thermal simulation classes, particularly compositional thermal simulation, because that was an area of my expertise, and it's a little more complicated than, say, just black oil simulation.
Right.
And so I've taught that. I've taught heavy oil forecasting. Uh, I've even done overviews of decision analysis for our business units. So there's just been multiple workshops, and I actually like to teach. So
Mhm. That's really cool. So maybe you become a professor of practice here. Yes, perfect. All right, let's now move to your early career and industry experience. And mainly, let's focus on the global experience. So, you have worked on the oil field across the globe from Can River to Venezuela and Kazakhstan. How did these diverse environments shape your approach to reservoir management and asset development? Like, did you find like a difference between the US and the different regions in the world? Like, how did this impact your career as well?
yeah, so there's a lot in that question. So let's kind of unpack that. So I'm gonna answer that from the perspective of the reservoir,
Mhm. Yeah.
and then from the perspective of the geography, because
Okay.
and you'll understand why I'm making the difference there. So yes, I've worked reservoirs all over the world, not just heavy oil reservoirs, but light oil reservoirs, gas, and I will tell you, obviously, the heavy oil reservoirs they don't flow naturally on their own in general. You generally have to use some kind of enhanced oil recovery technique, so it's a little more difficult. Um, and then from a geography perspective, um, you learn that when you're working in other countries with other companies, oftentimes you're working with national oil companies,
Mhm.
and you quickly learn that they have a much different business driver. And so sometimes, you know, moving ahead with a decision or a development plan in your mind seems very clear. This is what we should do. We need to drill these wells, or whatever it is that we're trying to do. And you quickly learn that alignment isn't always as easy as you think. And so you really learn a lot about that teaming. You really learn about trying to listen and understand, what really are the key business drivers
Mhm.
for your partners.
Mhm.
And then back to the reservoir, I guess kind of the other thing you'll learn is the reservoir is going to do what the reservoir is going to do. You can't fight Mother Nature. The best thing you can do is understand it,
Mhm.
and that's why you really go back and rely on your education and understand, you know, fluid flow, Darcy's law, thermodynamics. You need to understand all of that, because you're not going to be able to violate those rules and those scientific principles
Yeah.
when you're trying to produce a reservoir.
When we talk about like the people side, did you find like working at like these different areas in terms of like a culture inside the company different? Like,
You know, sometimes culturally it's different. So, like, for example, I'll give an example. Even something simple like working in what's called the partition zone, the
Mhm.
PZ. That's our Saudi Arabian partition zone business unit,
Mhm.
and it's essentially in between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
Mhm.
And so from a cultural perspective, sure, it's different. Like one of the first things is their work week is not Monday through Friday. It's Sunday through Thursday. And so you get used to starting your week on a Sunday. And so that's very different than the US. And so when you're trying to communicate to folks back in the US or vice versa, if you're in the US supporting that business unit, sometimes you have to adjust your schedules, obviously, for that. So it's little things like that you learn. Um, that's probably the big thing. I would say people at their core are all the same.
Right.
Um, but there are cultural differences.
For sure.
And also, people are a product of their environment. And so, I mentioned earlier that oftentimes when you're working on projects overseas,
Mhm.
you're working with a national oil company, and
Right.
and those project drivers are much different.
Right.
So in the United States, we're under essentially a capitalistic system.
Mhm.
Our ultimate bosses, it's not Mike Wirth, our CEO, but
Right.
it's really ultimately the shareholders of Chevron.
Exactly.
And we're trying to grow our stock price and make money for our shareholders. Whereas when you're working with a national oil company, making money isn't necessarily what they're concerned about. They may be more concerned about recovery factor, or they may be more concerned about training their national employees, or providing jobs for their national employees. And so sometimes the business drivers are much different.
Right. Yeah, this is really important point, like in terms of like what's the main focus of the company you're working for, and it changes from one place to another. All right. As a guru in heavy oil, you know, what are what are some of the most significant challenges that you have experienced in your whole life, like working in developing these heavy oil reservoirs? Could you please like sum up some of the main challenges of these kind of
Sure.
reservoirs?
So, the most obvious challenge, obviously, is when you think of heavy oil, obviously very high viscosity.
Mhm.
It generally does not flow on its own. Now, an exception of that is some of our assets in Venezuela,
Mhm.
because it does have a higher reservoir pressure, and it has sort of a high solution gas content that it will flow. In fact, it's interesting when it flows and you produce it, it actually looks almost like a mousse. It's like a foamy oil when it comes to surface. But with that exception, in general, you have to apply heat, you have to apply chemical, you have to apply advanced pumping technology in order to get this stuff to flow. So that can be very challenging. And then when you talk about, okay, if I'm going to apply heat, so the first thing most people think of is steam flooding. That's a very energy intensive process.
Mhm.
And so if you're going to ultimately be profitable in that, you have to get very, very good at what we call heat management.
Okay.
So in other words, only adding as much heat as is required to the reservoir. Don't add more than that. Add only enough, and understand that once you reach a certain temperature, you only need to add enough heat to maintain that thermal body. And so if that's the case over time, you can actually reduce your steam rates, and that generally greatly improves your operating expenses and things like that. So that's something that you don't necessarily see in a
Right.
light oil reservoir or,
Right.
or gas.
Mhm.
And then the other thing that's a challenge, particularly in today's world, is just the carbon intensity of heavy oil, because you have to uh, heat up the reservoir.
Right.
It tends to be one of the highest carbon intensity asset classes, at least in
Right.
Chevron's portfolio.
Right. Right. That's really interesting that you were working on the heavy oil and now you shifted like to the total opposite. We'll get back to this point. Talking about heavy oil reservoirs, and based like on your experience and like your time at Chevron, how have advancement in reservoir simulation and thermal technology transferred and also maybe improved the recovery factors from these kind of reservoirs?
Yeah, so I would say a couple things have happened on the reservoir simulation front. The first one was understanding that there are more mechanisms happening in the reservoir than just reducing the viscosity.
Mhm.
And in the old days of reservoir simulation, essentially all you would do is you'd have a temperature dependent correlation, you'd reduce the viscosity of the oil, and then you would run your simulations like that.
Mhm.
And what you quickly realized was there's a lot more than just that going on in the reservoir. There's a classic paper and graph from a gentleman named Willman,
Mhm.
and he did a graph that showed the relative contributions, solution gas drive, viscosity effect, compositional changes. And so when we realize that there's additional things you have to take into account, so things like compositional thermal simulation, the fact that you are actually stripping off light ends as you inject steam, the fact that oftentimes when we inject steam in the reservoir, we know that we don't pressure up.
Right.
But in a confined simulation model, our simulation models, you'll inject steam, and up until breakthrough of the steam to the producer wells, you'll get pressures in your model that are way high.
Okay.
And in fact, pressure and temperature correlate together based on the steam table. So then you'll get temperatures that we don't observe in the field. And so you start looking into all these mechanisms and you realize there's things like reservoir dilation.
Mhm.
And so you then all of a sudden you're having to look into correlations like BD Boberg, or you're having to do a like a geomechanical model in order to take all of this into consideration. But all of that, when you take all of that into account,
Mhm.
not only do you get better forecasts, but you're actually modeling reality better, and
Mhm.
it helps you really try to optimize your development. So
Mhm.
those are just some of at least the simulation technologies.
Mhm.
And then I think in a more general technology sense, we've gotten better at our pumps. We've gotten better with pumps being able to handle sand, for example. Um, we've gotten better at heat management. I already mentioned that. And then finally, just our EOR technologies. We're coming to understand that heat isn't the only way to produce heavy oil. And there is a real opportunity for chemical EOR
Okay.
and oil. We're kind of seeing a resurgence, at least in our assets. And the beauty of that is it will allow us to produce it in a much lower carbon intensive way.
All right. Let's get back to Chevron. How many years specifically? Like at Chevron? Wow, that's amazing. Wow. Tell us about like the working culture at Chevron, and like what have Chevron added to you as an engineer and also as a leader?
Sure. Um, there's all kinds of energy companies out there. There's small ones, there's independent ones, there's medium-sized ones, there's integrated energy companies, there's ones that are international. And for me, Chevron is a large integrated energy company. So it's integrated, meaning we have an upstream, a midstream, a downstream. Not only do we get our product out of the ground, but we actually turn it into a product that the consumers will use.
Mhm.
And so when you think about that, it allows you to approach problems from an entire value chain perspective, and that's tremendously exciting for me. It opens up a lot more opportunities. The other thing is, because it is international, you have the opportunity to work either in other countries, or even if, like, through our technical center, you can work on projects in other countries and still be in the United States. But the fact that you get to see those different reservoirs,
Mhm.
many smaller companies, they're wonderful companies, don't get me wrong, but they may only work in one country,
Mhm.
maybe even one asset. There are some small companies, believe it or not, that only work in the Permian. And so I think when it comes to opportunities, you just have to think, where do you fit in? And for me, I liked the breadth. I liked the scale. I liked the ability, the fact that we can do difficult. We have the financial resources that we can do large projects. And then I think the other thing that makes Chevron special is the people that I work with. It's always been the people,
Mhm.
and something called the Chevron way.
Right.
And I think, to me, when I think about the Chevron way, there's a lot of parallels between the Chevron way and Aggie core values. And maybe that's one reason why, to me, it was a very natural transition from A&M as a student
Right.
into industry and our core values. And it really is, it's not just words on a paper, right? It really is how we work, and it's how we treat each other. It's how we treat our partners in other countries, within the United States, government, partners, employees, and I think they have a great work-family life balance. We work a hybrid work schedule, and not every company does that.
Right, right.
Because we learned, hey, you really can work from home during the pandemic.
Right,
We
right.
got quite good at it, but we have so it's like you work at home a few days, you work in the office a few days, and those are just some of the things that I just really appreciate about Chevron.
Perfect, perfect. This is a great answer. Since you specifically talked about people, so as a technical team lead, what strategies did you apply in order to optimize the team performance? Of course, like you had a lot of team members under you working throughout these years at Chevron. So what specifically you have implemented in order to improve the performance of your team?
So I think the first thing it starts with is, when I get a new team that I'm going to be a team lead or a manager of, there's a classic book out there that I recommend all leaders read, and it's called The First 90 Days.
Right.
And it's such an incredible book because what it really does is it walks you through with every new team. You need to do an analysis. Is this a brand new team you're setting up? Is it a team that you're taking over that is completely broken, that you're going to have to completely change everything? Or is it a team that everything's running really well and your job is to maintain that? Or are there some incremental improvements? And I think when you do that diagnosis, it allows you to come up with a plan on how to develop your people. So, you always have to ask yourself, if I'm asking my team to do things, do they have the skills and the tools necessary? Do I need to get them additional training? Do I need to get them additional mentoring, additional tools or technology? So you always want to make sure that you have that in place. You can't ask your team to do something if they don't have the skills or the knowledge or the tools. I mean, that's just a basic principle, right? And so those are some of the things that I look at in order to develop at least my teams in the past, and make sure that they really perform. I think the other thing you need to do is make sure that they really understand what the goal is. What's the end game here? Do they really understand what business decision is being made or what we're trying to accomplish? And they need to be able to clearly tie what they do to that business outcome. How is what they do enable either the field's strategy, the business unit strategy, or Chevron as a whole, our corporate strategy? It all kind of comes down from that corporate strategy, right?
That's really cool and also exciting. Like when you get a new team and you work with them in order to achieve the whole goal of the unit that you're working on. All right. After that, let's move into your current position. So in 2024, you transitioned into a totally new position at Chevron, which is the director of lower carbon. And the first obvious question, what motivated you to shift into lower carbon initiatives? We know Chevron is one of the leading companies now when it comes to lowering carbon footprint in the US and in the world. Could you please tell us more about this position and how do you see the future of energy transitioning towards sustainability?
Sure. Well, everyone kind of chuckles when they hear, "Oh, you're the lower carbon director now." Hey, wait, weren't you a heavy oil guy? That's kind of, you've gone from something really high carbon intensity to low. Yeah. But if you think about that, that's actually why it was such a beautiful transition, because I had a lot of experience working some of our highest carbon intensity assets and understood what it was going to take to lower our carbon intensity. To me, it was kind of a natural transition. I know on the surface, people think, oh gosh, it's, you're doing something completely opposite, but it really was sort of a natural transition. And then in terms of, I guess, the future of energy, so our strategy, Chevron strategy, we want to leverage our strengths to safely deliver lower carbon energy to a growing world. And when you think about energy, the energy transition, sustainability, you're going to have affordable, reliable, ever cleaner energy, but you got to achieve kind of three things, right? Economic prosperity, energy security, and then environmental protection. And Chevron has had actually a long-standing history of communicating sustainability-related performance to our shareholders. We have a climate change resiliency report that we issue. We've had a methane report that we've issued. And we know that as the population of the world continues to grow, many energy solutions are going to be required. This is not. This is definitely an and world. It's not an or world because it's going to require all of it. I think when you think about renewables and the growth of renewables, things like wind and solar, there's no question they've grown quite a bit over the last several years, but they still represent a very small piece of the energy system. And so when you look at, again, that population growth, when you look at that, the total energy requirements that are going to be needed, even with the growth of that, the need for fossil fuels is still, it maintains pretty high all the way up to 2050 and beyond. And so, I think it's incumbent upon us that we're going to be working to develop, better processes, developing new technologies, we're investing in innovation in order to be able to solve that. And so Chevron's approach to sustainability, like, for example, we've allocated $10 billion through 2028. We've actually issued carbon intensity targets that we've publicly made that we want to achieve and trying to lower our carbon intensity. And then we're trying to grow our new lower carbon businesses through Chevron New Energy. So things like carbon capture, things like hydrogen, geothermal offsets. We're working on all of that in order to meet the goals of the energy transition.
Cool. So do you work directly with Chevron New Energies, like the different disciplines that you just mentioned, or mainly on the oil and gas side?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So Chevron New Energies is like, so we have many business units and regions, right? So Chevron New Energies is their own entity. I am the lower carbon director, but I am not in Chevron New Energies. I'm actually what's called our oil products and gas organization. So I'm the OPG lower carbon director. So my remit is all about lowering the carbon intensity of our current operations.
Okay.
But I do work hand in hand with CNE. I work with them because, for example, when you look at our current operations, we do lots of abatement projects to lower our emissions, but we know and understand that eventually those kind of opportunities are not going to be around, and the way to really be able to abate additional emissions is to go to what I call deep abatement opportunities. So that's things like carbon capture. So that's where CNE comes in, right?
Exactly. Okay. Moving from the heavy oil into lower carbon, do you think this has changed or evolved your leadership style, or it's basically similar when it comes to dealing with your team members?
My team management style is similar no matter what the challenge is. I very much believe in the, the idea of servant leadership, right?
Okay. Yes.
My team is not here to serve me. I am here to serve my team and enable them to accomplish a goal. And that goal helps Chevron accomplish its goals and strategies. So it's very much like that. There's different styles of leadership. I think people have probably heard the term command and control leadership. And I'll tell you that command and control has its place. Once in a while, you have to use that.
Yes.
But my opinion is it's got to be an exception. Because if you're a command and control leader, you're banging your hand on the table all the time and yelling, and you don't let your team have input. When there is a crisis, then it becomes very, very difficult to really make an impact. Because if that's your leadership style the whole time, then they think, oh, this is just the way he acts all the time, and they don't really understand when there's a crisis or when it does come time to command and control. They won't see the difference, right?
Exactly. I agree. Because you are the Texas A&M Chevron hiring manager or lead, so I want to mainly focus on that side. So first of all, could you please tell us more about this? Tell us more about this role. What do you do? How's this experience dealing with students going to career fairs? Obviously, you like it because you're here at Texas A&M at every career fair.
Yeah, so the way Chevron approaches recruiting, each school that we recruit at has a recruiting team, and it's really by function.
Mhm.
So I happen to be the petroleum engineering, used to be called recruiting team lead. Now it's senior talent ambassador.
Oh,
And
wow.
then members of the team are called talent ambassadors.
Mhm.
And I've done that role since probably 2009 or 10,
Wow.
right? And then I even recruited before that.
Mhm.
Probably I've recruited ever since I joined the company every year.
Wow.
And I do that because, I enjoy interacting with the students. And people don't realize this, but like for example, the folks on my recruiting team,
Mhm.
they're doing that because they want to. That is not their main job,
Mhm.
right? We all have a day job,
Right.
and then we do this as sort of extras, and it makes sometimes our day job more challenging because you have to be away from work. Particularly at a university the size of A&M, the number of students you interact with, the number of resumes you take, all that requires review, and it's a lot of work, to be honest.
Sure,
But
sure.
obviously I love it, and I love interacting with Aggies. So
Yeah, that's
anyway,
cool. So, do you have an advice for students who are studying, let's say, chemical engineering, petroleum engineering, geology, who might be worried about the future of oil and gas industry? So,
sure,
since you
yeah,
have the experience and also you have the recruiting also experience. So,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, so a couple things, and I'll just reemphasize a couple of points I made earlier. The world's population will continue to grow. All forms of energy are going to be required to meet future demand. And um, when you think about that, and you think about some of our, like the Chevron New Energies group that has been set up, when you think about carbon capture, when you think about geothermal,
Mhm.
the skills that are needed in that space are the same skills that you learn as a petroleum engineer, as a chemical engineer, as a mechanical engineer.
Right.
The laws of thermodynamics, conservation of mass and momentum. I mean, all of those are applicable.
Mhm.
So I think, my first message to students is, no, this is not a dying industry. No, these are not dying degrees.
Mhm.
The world is going to need it. In fact, they're going to need those skills more than ever before
Mhm.
in order to lower the carbon intensity of what we do as a society.
Thank you so much. We are approaching the end of the podcast,
Okay.
and since we are talking about Texas A&M jobs, students, energy sector, since you sit on the committee, the steering committee for the CCSS, which is the Carbon Capture and Storage Symposium at Texas A&M, which is going to be on its second version this year on October 28, 29. So a message to the public and also to students at Texas A&M and other universities.
Sure. So I had the privilege of being involved in the first one last year,
Mhm.
the Carbon Capture and Storage Symposium. And unlike many symposiums that I've been to, the beauty of it is it was a wonderful combination of academia, of students, and of industry.
Right.
Students, and everyone gets something from it, right?
Right.
Students go and they're going to hear from industry leaders, they're going to hear from professors. Industry is going to go there, they're going to get to interact with students, and you really get to hear from the players in the carbon capture industry, right? And so it's a great opportunity, and I highly recommend students to sign up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. I'm going to end the podcast with a question, and mainly this is a personal. What is one of your most memorable projects in your career? Something that has changed something in you in leadership style or maybe in the technical aspect. A particular project or achievement that stands out.
Yeah, so probably one of the projects that stands out was for our Petro PR asset, which is basically, it used to be called the Hamaca field. It's a Venezuelan oil field,
Mhm.
and we ended up winning a reservoir management excellence award that they only award a few each year
Mhm.
to certain teams and assets. And what I loved about that project was it truly was a cross-functional team
Okay.
It wasn't just reservoir engineers, but it was reservoir production, drilling, working with facilities, all coming up with an asset development plan that was economic and maximized not only the financial aspects of the project, but also the recovery, the production and the recovery of it. And it was just really fun, to be honest. I mean, you got to use some simulation, you got to use business acumen, you got to use reservoir management principles, and yeah, it was one that really made kind of an impact on me. And I think just by the nature of the cross functional team, um, it really emphasized the importance of teaming.
Right.
Again, you're probably hearing this recurring theme
Right.
during this podcast for me of teaming. It started at A&M and it continues today. That the challenges we have are difficult. They're not easy, right? In the energy industry, and not a single person, not a single company can solve all of them. It's really going to take partnerships. It's going to take teaming in order to do that.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate your being one of our top volunteers for Texas A&M Society of Petroleum Engineers, and also for giving us the time today for this podcast. Any final thoughts or feedback that you have for us or for the podcast listeners?
Gigamaggies.
All right, Gigam. Thank you so much, Chris, and have a great day.
You too.
Thanks.